Excited to talk more NFL, this time with special guest Connor Allen. Connor and I, we hooked up last year on a show. I don't even remember which team we covered last year, but I know it's always great to talk to you because you produce a lot of material out there for the masses. And I think it really educates people. And that's my niche. That's what I like to do, is educate people. So thanks for doing that. Thanks for coming on here. How are you today?
I'm great. Yeah, appreciate you having me on. I don't remember what team we talked about last year either. And yeah, as you mentioned, I've been trying to put out a lot more different data and threads and things like that. Some people don't like it because they call it engagement farming, all this stuff. My goal is to try and provide actual, like, at least interesting information. Not all of it's useful, just interesting information that some people might find useful and others might not. But Twitter's algorithm loves threads. So that's just what we're wrapping it in, and we're rolling with that.
I mean, why not? The NFL is 24/7. We
Yep.
have all the data points for the NFL now. We have the schedule, the exact schedule. We have free agency. We have the draft. There's not really much of a reason to wait. And that's why with the Giants, I don't know where to begin with the Giants, because when we last saw them, their offensive line was allowing yet another sack, because we're talking about 85 sacks last year. And it wasn't just that I thought, okay, well, they missed Daniel Jones. Who knows what parade of quarterbacks that they put out after that. But Daniel Jones, they sacked him 23 times in the first 4 games to begin with. They try to do some things in free agency. Singletary's in, Barkley's out, Brian Burns is in. What's your assessment of the roster, or what was it before the draft?
Yeah, I thought that they're an interesting team for a lot of reasons that you mentioned there. I mean, offensive line was, still a big need, and I think something that many people thought they were going to address early in the draft because they still had two specific holes. I think center and right tackle specifically, I thought were both still massive goals. And then heading into the draft, wide receiver, without a true alpha heading into the draft, they were, left with some group of guys who I like to consider, Jags, just the guys, like they're
Yeah.
Darius Slayton, Wandale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt can be like a good field stretcher, I think, or maybe not good, fine field stretcher. And then there are still some, I think, defensive gaps, especially in the interior defensive line and secondary mainly. But, the addition of Brian Burns was, I think, fairly sizable, especially when you pair him with Kayvon Thibodeau, because certain teams have gotten away with and been successful with just really relying on their pass rushers and, kind of executing through that way defensively. So, I think that there's more range of outcomes here that we'll discuss throughout the show, but that was my assessment there, post free agency.
I've got to be honest, I was never a fan of Wink Martindale, the hire. He didn't have the same roster with the Giants as he did with Baltimore, and he telegraphs all his plays, and the better teams and the better quarterbacks took advantage of that. He's gone. Shane Bowen is in. What's your assessment of, what can you tell us about Shane, or what they might do differently?
Yeah, the biggest difference for me is going to be the reliance on the blitz. So we're looking at Wing Martindale. He blitzes a ton. The last 2 years, he blitzed 32 and 39% of the time. It's like consistently one of the highest blitz rates in the league. Now we're switching to Shane Bowen, who, comes from Tennessee and had much lower blitz rate, 21% and 18% the last 2 years. So I think he's going to rely more, again, kind of alluded to it here, more on those pass rushers to try and get home and sit back, because the secondary is not good enough to leave them exposed. And we saw
Right.
that last year plenty of times. Like, if you send the house and you don't get home, you're in trouble. You're in real trouble there. So I think that they're going to dial back the blitz rate, rely more on their scheme. And Shane Bowen in his early press conferences has been like, I want guys just to be able to play their game. They're going to, focus on everything they need to do. Like, it's very simple. Like, it seems like he's just going to scale things back, not complicated things, and just make it a little bit easier for this defense, which I think will be a net positive for this defensive front.
Yeah, I think it's something hopefully the New York Giants and their fans will look forward to not rely on the blitz so much. This is a slide I put up with my top needs, and like to compare it with yours. Mine was wide receiver to start out, especially a feature wide receiver, and we know they hit that. 2 offensive linemen, definitely up there. When you allow 85 sacks, you better start doing something. Yeah. I would like to see a plugger in the middle and a better cover corner. Those were my needs. Those are the draft, and not a big draft, 6 picks overall. Walk us through the draft in your eyes.
Yeah, well, starting at 6 overall, it's interesting because there was rumors about, the Giants potentially taking a quarterback, which I think would have been a mistake just given their roster build. I mean, you've laid it out pretty well here. Like they still have plenty of very important needs. And so I don't think even if no matter who they drafted 6 overall, like would have really been able to come in and make a big impact. So we got Malik Neighbors 6 overall. I think that's a massive pick. Like adding an alpha wide receiver can change the whole dynamic of a receiving room. As I mentioned, the rest of the guys are, not super good, but I think they're like fine supporting options. Again, like Jalen Hyatt can stretch the field. Wan'Dale Robinson can be used behind the backfield and over the middle. Like they're those like all together with an alpha like Malik Neighbors, I think can be a passable or reasonable wide receiver room. So I think that was a good pick there. Then they addressed another need with safety Tyler Nubin. I thought that was again a solid pick, and then they kept with the secondary corner Andrew Phillips there. I did like some of the middle round picks though because they were almost anticipatory with the retirement of Darren Waller with their pick with Theo Johnson there. Again, I don't know how good Theo Johnson is going to be, but at least they had the foresight to be like, hey, we should probably start adding high upside guys in the middle rounds, along with again their running back room, like they added to that with Tyrone Tracy. In addition, Devin Singletary. Are they Saquon Barkley combined? Definitely not. But again, like they're trying to do the most with what they have, and I think that given their needs and given what they drafted, I thought that they did a reasonable job. They didn't make any crazy splashes or any moves down up, but it's they got things that players they needed, and I would say solid prospects at that.
Yeah, and Brian Burns, for me, and he should for others, counts in the draft grade because he costs them a second and a fifth. So you add Burns to the table, and they got some impact players, especially at the top of the draft. Neighbors could certainly be one of the top players in this draft. He can be electric. The big question is Daniel Jones' internal clock and the offensive line that's protecting for him. So I'm disappointed they didn't go offensive line even once. What do you think they do on offense to compensate for what I think is going to be a problem in terms of having time in the pocket?
Yeah, I have transparently no idea. I think this is going to be still an issue. It's going to rely a lot on Brian Dable to figure out schematically ways to get the ball out quick to avoid this, because you have right tackle Evan Neal, who is currently, I think, rehabbing still. But the last 2 years, since being drafted 7th overall by the Giants, 80th out of 81st in PFF grades in 2022, 80th out of 81st again in 2023. Consistently not very good. And then we have John Michael Schmitz as well, who's the worst graded center last year, according to PFF too. So like those are not just passable, like those are bad, the legitimately bad pieces that the Giants have right now in place. Sorry, Mike came and plugged there. Currently slotted as starters. And so I'm a little worried. And, I don't think that PFF is like, some end all be all, but I think for specific positions like offensive line and certain positions like that, where they're watching and grading every snap, I think it can be a useful point to kind of at least directional point in how good a player is. So thought that was noteworthy and certainly something that I don't have the answer to what they're going to do. Maybe you do. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because in some ways, and I want to get into this a little bit later at the end of the show, but in some ways, I like the staff. I like DeBall as a coach. I think in a way, you look at their record wasn't very good last year. They made the playoffs the year before. I think he overachieved both years, especially if you look at it from Pythagorean theorem principles, that actually maybe they shouldn't have won as many games as they did last year. But what's the ceiling for Daniel Jones to begin with? This seems like a bridge year at quarterback. Can he do it? Can he not?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up because I think that was my conclusion as well. So we might be in agreement here because, but we'll get to that at the end. But so I think specifically for Daniel Jones, I think the ceiling is, a better version of 2022. He threw for 3,200 yards, 15 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, 6.8 yards per attempt. I mean, they had a lot of the same receivers. No one was really good. The offensive line was better than it is, now at this point. But like, it's not like they were a great dominant unit. I don't know. I think that he, at this point, with Malik Neighbors, he could be in a better position here. So I don't know. I think that the ceiling is like a slightly better version. I don't think, he's really a chance to win MVP or anything like, real ceiling. But like, I think that he could be, again, like return to his 2022 form, which I think was in most sides, again, they made a playoff run. They won a game. Like it was a passable offense at that point in time.
They certainly have upgraded at wide receiver last year and this year. So there's really going to be no excuse in the passing game other than creatively moving them out of the pocket or doing things such as that. Last year's schedule, I don't know if you remember, last year's schedule was absolutely brutal in terms of how many home games they had early, where they were going and stuff like that, the opponents faced. It just seemed unfair. It put them behind the eight ball anyway, and they made the playoffs and they drafted late and the primetime games and so on. This year's schedule, I don't, you know, I don't know if you've looked at it that much. I kind of looked at it. I don't see any particularly terrible spots or particularly any easy spots for them. Do you have any take on the schedule?
No, it's interesting because they're just such a unique team that they play obviously plenty of good teams, but they also have, again, in the division, they have the Commanders, so they get them twice. Like it's not like their schedule is so overly daunting that you're looking at this and you're like, oh God, like, it's over. What's interesting is that the markets are factoring in their flaws in terms of like, I guess roster construction pretty heavily. They're favored in 4 games all year in current local lines, none by more than 1.5. Interesting. They're only underdogs of 3 or less in 7 total games this season. So they're favored in 4 games. The other, there's only 3 more games all season that they're actually between 0 and +3. The rest that they're bigger underdogs of over 3 for 10 games this season. So again, I don't want to double count kind of what we're talking about already, but I think that it was something that it's certainly, the market certainly seems to be down on them, and like where they currently stand in the season, like if we have any faith in them winning a couple games, like I think that there could be ways to play it. Not sure how to do it, but my first second schedule was like, okay, no one is giving them credit for anything, and they get to play the Bucks, Panthers, Saints, Commanders, Vikings, Seahawks, which are all, in my mind, not teams that are necessarily like top of the barrel. So.
Yeah, I just finished the recap on Washington, and Washington to me has a wider range of outcomes because it's a whole new culture. They brought in 18 free agents. They drafted a whole bunch of players. They're trying to draft team-oriented guys and so on. They, like the New York Giants, are trying to crack the top of the division. And you have to win in the division. Washington hasn't been able to do that. The Giants have their, I don't know the last time they've won against Dallas. I don't think they have a great track record against Dallas. Dallas and Philly have been the clear top 2. Now we're looking at divisional odds. Best I've seen is about plus 1,200. Giants win total tends to be around 6.5, 6.5 most places, juice here and there. You could get, what did I see? You could get minus 135 on the under. You could get plus 122 on the over. That's kind of my quick assessment before going on the show here. Any thoughts on their season win or the divisional outlook?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because we think of like how poor, I guess the Giants were the last 2 years, really. So, Brian, I think if you rewind in time here and look at their roster in 2022, they were not a good roster. They were like a bad team that greatly overperformed. And I think a lot of that had to do with Brian Daboll. And then we look at 2023, they still won 6 games. Like in my mind, I don't know why. Like it's just like, oh, they won like 3, 4, maybe 5 games. They won 6 games last year. And now, there are some material upgrades. They're definitely flawed in a lot of areas, but there are some material upgrades. So, again, I was hoping to get a little bit better number than 6.5. I don't know why. Again, like in my mind, it seemed like more we'd get like a flat 6 or 5.5, maybe a little bit juiced. I thought that would be really interesting. 6.5. Not entirely sure on the divisional odds though. It's just like, I hate having 2 points of like 2 needed points of failure essentially. So like it's not like, oh, if Team X's the top team in the division quarterback goes down, they could win, or maybe they're projected to be close to them. There's 2 really, really good teams in their division, like the Cowboys and the Eagles. So it would take a lot for the Giants to win this division, given both the strengths of the Cowboys and the Eagles. So for me, I can't get there even at 12-1. I think that's still a little bit too far fetched, but the win total, there's some alt win total overs. If you do want to go that way, 8.5 at circa has some interesting juice. So I don't know. I think that there's upside with this team just because of Brian Daboll and some of the additions with Malik Neighbors. But I'm concerned because I think the downside is still pretty strong as well.
Yeah, it's still an incomplete roster. I think we've talked about that offensive line, maybe a little bit. And they're young in the secondary. They had a couple of very young people last year. Burns is a great addition. But I think if DeBall's not there, based on their point ratios and everything else, we've got a problem because they, I think they were a 4-win team that somehow got to 6 wins last year. So if you
Yep.
start with that as your number one thing there, that's a problem. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I wrote this down and now I'm a little concerned. Did they have a double-digit turnover ratio advantage last year?
I'm not
I want
sure
to
off
check
the top
that
of my
for
head, but
you.
that does sound right. I thought that was maybe the year prior that they had the massive
Yeah,
turnover
I'm gonna look.
differential.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm looking real
no, they
quick
did.
on this one.
2023. Yep. Plus 12 turnover differential
That's
right
what I
there.
thought.
Yep.
I want to say, how did that happen? Because they didn't have great quarterback play. Obviously, they didn't turn it. They must have forced a lot of turnovers. But the reason I mentioned that is there's the best they could do is, in my opinion, is get a +6, +7 turnover ratio. But if they go flat in turnover ratio, they give up
Yeah.
a whole mess of points again. So I'm going to put up this last slide here. And that's my final thoughts. Pivotal year for coach and quarterback. I don't want to put DeBall on the hot seat because I think he'd be snatched up right away somewhere. But the record is such that teams get antsy in the NFL. Draft class added talent, but as we said, not along the O line. That I think there's going to be turnover ratio regression, and I think they need to win right away just to get going and hope the defensive coordinator makes a difference. Based on these final thoughts, please add your own. What are your final takeaways for the New York Giants?
Yeah, I will go ahead and say I think Brian Dable is on the hot seat, and that if they win fewer than 6 games, that he'll be fired. There was rumors that he was, already on the hot seat entering, like after last season, and so another tough season, which is interesting. I do agree that he would be scooped up quickly because I think that some of the overachievement is reliant on the coach there. So I think that's notable. But the turnover ratio regression that you mentioned there is pretty much undeniable, especially given that they're changing schemes. And part of Wink Martindale's thing is just kind of chaos, and it leaves them exposed, but it also can cause turnovers, which again is very impactful in the future. So yeah, this is a team that I want to like and I want to be excited about, but the offensive line play is just really a struggle for me because it is going to be so reliant on scheme and Daniel Jones' execution of said scheme, or maybe Drew Lock. And we might see him at some point as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can do that, then maybe there's a way. It's the old. It's like what we saw with kind of the Bengals and the memes of them. Whether they draft Penei Sewell, or draft Jamar Chase, and it's like,
Oh yeah.
are they protecting him, or are they just going to have the guy who can get open quickly? And so I think that the Giants are going to have to rely on that. It's going to have to be someone open very quickly, getting the ball out quick, and that's not necessarily been Daniel Jones' strong suit. So I have plenty of concerns here. I think if they put it all together, they could win 7-8 games. But I think like you said, the downside here is it's pretty significant.
I like that you brought up the Penei Sewell one because I found that one of the most fascinating discussions I've ever had to deal with. I had no right answer whether it would be Sewell or the wide receiver, and
Yeah.
maybe the same is here with Alt versus. Although they didn't have a chance to get Alt, I think it would have been interesting if Alt was available at this particular point. But then again, Joe Burrow and Daniel Jones, they're one's better than the other. So
Yeah.
that's probably a thing here. So my bottom line here is I think the Giants have improved their roster, but there's so many things working in their disfavor. They're going to lose points. I think they stole a couple wins last year. As hard as that seems with just 6 wins, and now with the turnover ratio regression that I expect, I'm kind of bearish on the New York Giants, but we'll see what happens. I'm rooting for DeBall. Final question from me is, you have the crystal ball. It's 2025. Is Daniel Jones the starting quarterback?
My guess would be no, unless they win like 9-10 games. I think even in a normal, like neutral 7-8 win season, which we would consider a pretty massive success in our eyes, given their talent, schedule, and everything, I don't think he's the quarterback. I mean, there was already rumblings pre-draft about them not being interested in Daniel Jones. He has a clause in his contract that if he suffers another season-ending injury this year, that they have to pay him for the following year. I think that could incentivize them even further to move on from him mid-season if things are not going well already. So it's something that I think could end very quickly, and like the path to him being their quarterback in 2025 in my mind is very narrow. Again, it's like 9, 10 plus wins.
So finishing up with the New York Giants and Washington. Next up for me will be the let's see, the Philadelphia Eagles, and then Dallas is coming up as well. Those are the front runners, but these are fascinating teams. So Connor, I absolutely appreciate the fact that you came on to discuss the New York Giants. I think they are going to be a very interesting team to watch. Let's see how Neighbors hit the ground running. Thanks again for joining me on this show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Ron. This is a wild team to talk about, and not one that I came in with too many preconceived notions about, and was excited to kind of dig deep on and try and learn more. And I guess my takeaway didn't lead me to too many bets or anything crazy, but it helped me dial in, I think, on specifics about the New York Giants.
And I think that's the purpose of these shows for me, and hopefully for people who watch these shows now or catch them on replay on YouTube, is that it just stimulates thought. And the more takeaways that one can have, the more dialogue on these teams, the better. So thanks everybody for watching this show, and I'll be back tomorrow and next week to wrap up the rest of the NFC. Let's see what the Giants are going to be doing in 2024. It's going to be interesting. Thanks.